Hello, and welcome to Heritage Toronto's audio walk, drive, or ride tour of Don Mills. I'm your host, Dave LeBlanc. If you're a Globe and Mail reader or a News Talk 1010 listener, you may know me better as the Architourist. In my audio vignettes and in my Friday newspaper column in Globe Real Estate, I often tackled 1950s and 60s architecture. The post-war period was one of the most optimistic and experimental eras of architecture in Canadian history, and in Toronto specifically, there is no place that better demonstrates this than Don Mills. For those of you who have dismissed the area as just another suburb, I hope to convince you, by the end of this podcast, that that assessment couldn't be further from the truth.
Don Mills is now wrapped into the suburbs. It still is like a new town.
That's Macklin Hancock, chief planner of Don Mills, in an interview I did with him in 2004. With his help, I'll prove to you that not only is Edward Plunkett Taylor's Don Mills not a suburb, it has connections to the most influential design school of the 20th century, Germany's Bauhaus, which was founded in 1919 by Walter Gropius. As we walk and talk, we'll hear from some of the other people who built this community and whom I have been lucky enough to interview. But first, we're going to hear from Jennifer Torrey, Regional President of RBC. RBC Foundation is a generous supporter of Heritage Toronto's iTour program.
Thank you for joining us today on this excursion to explore Toronto's heritage. From the time we opened our very first branch in 1903 on the corner of Yonge and Wellington, RBC Royal Bank's journey has been one of partnering with other prominent city builders to help create this strong and diverse metropolis. RBC, our clients, and our employees share a deep affection for this great city. We take pride in our long and continuing chapter in Toronto's story, from building new branches to building careers to building communities through our countless philanthropic activities that enrich our city, like being the biggest corporate supporter of United Way, helping organizations welcome newcomers to Canada, as well as sponsoring these podcasts to share our strong shared history. Whether you're new in town or a local like me who is seeing the city through new eyes, I hope you enjoy taking in the sights and sounds of Toronto, past and present. I invite you to let your imaginations run wild as we step back through time to discover our diverse history and hear the tales of this vibrant city. Finally, as you wander through our neighbourhoods, keep an eye out on every street corner for an RBC footprint. From the interesting architectural styles spanning the decades showcased in our local branches, to the famous gold Royal Bank Plaza towers on Bay Street, to community events like the Toronto Film Festival, Winter City, and RBC Daisy Fest. RBC is truly privileged to be part of the local landscape and to help tell Toronto's stories today. We look forward to helping create many more tales and working together to build this great city. I hope you enjoy your tour.
So, wherever you are right now, you'll first have to make your way to the intersection of Don Mills Road and Lawrence Avenue East. Whether you're coming from the 401 or the Gardiner Expressway, get on the Don Valley Parkway and exit at Lawrence Avenue West. Once you're on Lawrence heading westbound, proceed 1 kilometer to the intersection of Don Mills Road and Lawrence Ave, then go past it until you see the Shoppers Drug Mart on your right-hand side. Pull into the parking lot and get out of your car. When you get there, I'll give you walking directions to our first stop. Please press pause now and play when you get there. You should now be in the Shoppers parking lot on Lawrence Avenue. Make your way to the sidewalk on Lawrence Avenue. To get to our first stop, if you are looking across Lawrence Avenue, turn to your left and walk along the sidewalk to the corner of Don Mills and Lawrence. Make your way across Don Mills Road, watch the traffic, to the little parkette on the northeast corner. Find the blue and gold plaque about Don Mills and we'll chat there. Hit pause now and press play when you get there. Before we get into what makes the present Don Mills so worthy of our attention, let's talk a bit about what was here before, a good way to understand how dramatic the building of this new town was. You can't appreciate the present without having a hold on the past. In the rush of this very busy connection between two transit corridors, try to imagine a very different Don Mills. Hundreds of years ago, and for millennia before, this area was used by Aboriginal peoples who called southern Ontario home. Then, in the early 1800s, European settlers established farms in the area. They were joined by the Hogg and Gray families, in particular, who operated a grist mill, still standing on the Donalda Golf Club, and 2 sawmills on the West Don River nearby. Alexander Milne built his mills at Lawrence and what is now the DVP first in the 1830s. Mills were drivers of the local economy, of course, and the cluster of them here led to the name we know this place by today. By the 1850s, the crossroads of Don Mills Road and Lawrence Avenue, then just rough wagon paths through fields, was becoming a center for the surrounding farming community. No village per se ever existed here, but the corner eventually hosted the local one-room school and an inn. Further north stood a general store, post office, library, known by the name of its operator, Aggie Hogg. When one of Canada's most powerful businessmen, Edward Plunkett Taylor, began eyeing this area in the 1940s, not much had changed from the 1880s. Photos from the period showed dirt roads in a rural landscape. Intrigued by the expanse of developable land not far from Toronto's downtown, E.P. Taylor decided to change all of that. Through his company, O'Keefe Realty Limited, Taylor bought out the farming families in the area and acquired about 2,000 acres here. Debate remains about what E.P. first had in mind for this area, a new brewery for O'Keefe's. Taylor eventually formed a new company, Don Mills Developments, to manage his new acquisition and put a man by the name of Carl Fraser in charge. Plans began to solidify around a residential development, and then Carl Fraser offered his son-in-law, Macklin Hancock, the job of planning that development. More on Hancock later, but suffice it to say that he was still in his 20s and studying urban planning at Harvard with some of the greatest minds in the field. Hancock decided to put the latest theories about urban development to work here, and he had virtually free rein to do so. Hancock pushed Don Mills beyond any old residential suburb into a new town, a new urban area complete with schools, churches, industry, and the latest in shopping facilities. This was not to be a place where you slept and hung out on weekends. It was to be a brand new town, with all of the different buildings and services that entails. With that concept in place, Hancock determined to organize this new town in a way that controlled the exploding impact of the automobile. Heavy traffic would be confined to main corridors and kept off of residential streets. To make sure that would work, he made residential roads into looping streets and cul-de-sacs, streets that you would only drive on if you lived on them. And then he organized the whole plan of the area to minimize driving, to make sure where people lived was close to where they would need to shop and work. And here's where we get to the defining guts of his plan: neighbourhoods. To make this huge new town livable, they expected nearly 30,000 people to live here someday, Hancock devised a plan that broke up the area into residential quadrants, each with its own school, churches, and parks. Those quadrants encircled the central shopping area. Pedestrian pathways led from each quadrant back to the shopping center so that, says Hancock,
you could go around your town without getting in the way of high-speed cars. And that's why all these little lanes are connected to the center.
Outside of the residential areas and separated by ring roads, the Donway East and the Donway West, were the industrial areas. The final, protective outer layer were the green belts. Wilkett Creek to the west, a golf course and E.P. Taylor's own Winfield's Farm to the north, the Don Valley to the east, and Flemington Farm to the south, which later became the Flemington Park development. Think of it as a target. The smallest circle at the center is the shopping center. Then the next slightly bigger circle contains the 4 residential quadrants. Then the third largest circle has the industries. Then the fourth and final circle is the green one, the green belts. Of course, these boundaries are much harder to see today, since Don Mills proper has been surrounded by builders' developments on all sides. But when it was all crisp and new in the mid-1950s, it was much clearer and as modern as jet travel. To situate you right now, you are at the center of the target. On each corner around you is the tip of each quadrant, and kitty corner across the road is the commercial area. And to put this in context, when Macklin Hancock came up with this plan, there wasn't another new development like it in Canada. One more point. Look back across the road to the northwest corner. See that English oak tree and the big circular planter? It dates back to the birth of this modern new town, when Woodland Nurseries, founded by Macklin Hancock's parents in Mississauga, established a branch on that corner to sell trees and shrubs for the greening of the new subdivision. The plants offered here were chosen to thrive in this particular area, And if you note the green neighborhoods of Don Mills today, you'll agree that they were chosen well. Neat, eh? That long introduction is important, I think, to set the big picture for this tour. As we walk, we'll hear more about Hancock and the other people who helped make this place so unique. Mostly, however, we'll talk about how Don Mills was not just unique for its master plan, but for its modern architecture. That's modern with a capital M. To get to our next stop, walk back the way you came and stand again on the sidewalk in front of the Shoppers Drug Mart. Please press pause now and play when you get there. You are now standing on the sidewalk in front of Shoppers. Look across the street at Cadillac Fairview's new Shops at Don Mills. This is the third-generation commercial hub here at Lawrence and Don Mills. We'll talk about that later. But first, I'd like to direct your gaze to the mural on the wall in between the two shop fronts. Snazzy, isn't it? Not only is it snazzy, it holds many abstract shapes and symbols that can still be found here today, which is why the artist, Budapest-born Charles Stauffer, named it Don Mills Montage when he created it while working as staff architect for Eaton's back in 1962. Residents of the area may remember that the mural's original location was on the wall of the old white brick Eaton store, one of their first suburban locations, which was much farther back from the street. Stauffer designed and built the mural himself, mostly in his basement, on weekends. This from a Cadillac Fairview press release.
When my boss, Eaton's chief architect, E.L. Hankinson, gave me the opportunity to design and create this mural, I was very excited to get involved, recalls the gentleman with the infectious smile. To the untrained eye, the mural might look like a colorful jumble of shapes and colors, but the longtime Don Mills resident explains he had the community in mind when he set pencil to sketch paper. Look closely, and the neighborhood comes to life with houses and apartment buildings, the local sports arena and golf club, the old curling rink dome, religious institutions, family life, and even the Don River and Edwards Gardens. It took him about a month to build the mural. When it was finally erected on the Don Mills Center, Charles climbed the scaffolding to put on the final touches, and his picture appeared in the Toronto Daily Star.
Thanks to Stauffer, who died just a few days before the official opening of the new complex, we can still see the Flying Saucer Curling Dome, which was demolished, sadly, in 1986 after only a few decades of use. I'd now like to take you for a bit of a walkabout of the northeast quadrant of Don Mills. We'll start with the Don Mills Library, a great place to talk about modern architecture. If you are still facing across the road looking towards the Shops at Don Mills, turn right and start walking towards the intersection with the Donway West. Cross at the lights and look for the boulder in the grass in front of the library. Don't worry, you'll see it. You can hit pause now. You should now be standing in front of the Don Mills branch of the Toronto Public Library. In 1953, Montrealer Douglas Lee, younger than Hancock at just 25, joined the team as architect in charge. This dynamic duo was responsible for everything, from the overall concept right down to the naming of streets. Douglas Lee.
A lot of the success was we didn't have that much experience in the development field, so we were able to push what we wanted because we didn't know what we couldn't do.
Young and enthralled by the latest ideas in design, Hancock and Lee laid down the law on what Don Mills would look like. Independent builders were offered small batches of lots from the Don Mills Development Corporation only if they agreed to one condition. There would be no Victorian, Edwardian, or any other dead monarch's frills applied to any structure in town. Houses, libraries, churches, banks, and even factories would be modern, with a capital M, or they wouldn't get built. And if a builder didn't have an approved architect, one would be provided. Color palettes for homes were prepared by Hancock's sister, Marjorie, a graduate of the Ontario College of Art, now known as OCAD.
We actually did the site plans for all of the houses so that the streetscape could be coordinated by us. When we couldn't get roofing colors, we asked the different roofing manufacturers to produce colored shingles that would fit into the color scheme. It was interesting that not only did we initiate changes in the actual building styles and designs, but in fact introduced changes to some of the manufacturers' palettes.
Hancock and Lee amassed a stable of architects and builders that would eventually become Canada's brightest stars. Names like Peter Dickinson, James A. Murray, Henry Fleece, Irving Grossman, and John B. Park & Associates all worked for Hancock at various stages. Builders that would go on to big things were Al Green. Ever heard of Greenwin Property Management? George Slightum, and many others. To get at what those architects produced, let's look at this library. This is a good place to introduce you to modern architecture, a big part of what made Don Mills unique. Although it's been lengthened and that curved addition tacked onto the front to expand the foyer space, much of the original building is visible. That interlocking diamond roof, which you saw in Mr. Stafford's mural, by the way, is quite a nice piece of engineering. If you can see inside the windows of the library, you'll see what I mean. That's the thing about modernist architecture. You wouldn't be looking at that shape if it didn't inform you as to the way the structure is designed. In other words, no modernist architect worth his or her salt would put a conventional roof on a building and then slap diamond shapes onto the outside as ornament. There is an honesty to modernist architecture, and we'll see that a little later when we look at some post and beam houses. The firm that designed the library was Craig, Medill, Abram, and Ingelson. Scarborough residents may know another of their buildings for its striking roof structure, the servery portion of the former Midland Avenue Collegiate Institute at 720 Midland Ave, now called Bond Academy. Next, walk towards the library on the grass, but curve around it and aim for that street with the single-family houses you see behind it. That's Jocelyn Crescent, and it was the very first street to have homes constructed on it in 1953. Once you get to Jocelyn, turn left and walk west, following the curve of the street. Stop when you get to number 55 and I'll tell you a little about that home's architect. Press pause now. You should now be standing in front of number 55 Jocelyn Crescent. If so, I hope you haven't aroused too much suspicion. Pretend you're looking for a lost contact lens while I introduce you to Henry Fleece, who lived here.
So we were among the first people who moved in. It was exciting, but it also, people were wondering why we moved into all that mud. I had a small office near Bloor and Young, and when we moved into the house, it was a split level, so the lower level had a walkout, and I used it as an office temporarily, where we designed more houses. I think it lasted about 9 months at the most, because people were beginning to complain about the blueprint trucks that were coming and delivering and racing through Jocelyn.
Fleece was one of a number of young, up-and-coming architects who cut their teeth in Don Mills, and who loved it so much, he chose to stay. Born in Leipzig, Germany in 1921, by age 15, Henry Fleece traveled to Deal, England, to attend secondary school because, he told me once during another interview, I could see what was happening in Germany more than some other people. As a teenager, I think you sense it more. After graduation, he apprenticed with an architecture firm on the advice of his principal. When World War II broke out, he was rounded up as a friendly prisoner and brought to a camp on the Isle of Man, upon which he was transported to Newfoundland, then Trois-Rivières, and finally to a New Brunswick camp where he quite enjoyed planting and chopping down trees. After the war, he decided to remain in Canada. He moved to Toronto to continue his studies under the University of Toronto's professor Eric Arthur. He's the person that influenced my life, said Fleece, who became a Canadian citizen in 1945 and graduated in 1946. Looking for work, he spotted a University of British Columbia advertisement calling for teachers. He went to Arthur for a letter of recommendation, but was offered a job teaching architectural design at U of T instead. Fleece taught at the university until he became too heavily involved with Don Mills in 1953 and resigned. He designed the house at number 55, along with others on this street. In fact, Fleece designed about a dozen other house types in Don Mills, and there are approximately 250 of these designs scattered about the 4 quadrants, so you'll run into some more. Now let me give you some directions to the next stop. Remember, Don Mills roads are never straight, so ignore your internal compass, listen carefully, and pay close attention to your printed map or to the map on the screen of your handheld device, if it has one. We are going to walk and make 4 left turns to get back to Lawrence Avenue. Walk down Jocelyn to Langbourne Place and turn left. From Langbourne Place, take your first left onto Norden Crescent. From Norden Crescent, take the first left onto Gladwin Road. From Gladwin Road, take the first left onto Tremont Crescent. Tremont Crescent will take you back to Lawrence. As you walk, I'd like to tell you more about Macklin Hancock. But I'd also like you to look around and begin to note some of the things we'll talk about later on this tour. The old-growth trees, the winding, quiet residential streets, and the range of housing types and designs. It's hard to imagine today, but in the 1950s, these aspects of what was then a brand new residential development were nearly revolutionary. So start walking, and I'll tell you why. Born in China to missionary parents, Macklin Hancock once told me, "I'm just a farmer," even though his business card states, rather impressively, that he's a designer of, quote, towns and cities, environments, and habitats, end quote. That's the sort of humility I've run into often when interviewing these can-do, mid-century people. Hancock first got his hands dirty at 6 years old working alongside his father, Leslie, who began Mississauga's Woodland Nurseries in 1931. Studying the natural world at such an early age would prepare young Mac for his education as a landscape architect when he attended his father's alma mater, the Ontario Agricultural College, now the University of Guelph, and then, after the war, when he attended Harvard for postgraduate work. I should mention here that Mac flew Spitfires in the war and would continue to fly airplanes for the rest of his life. Two of Hancock's professors at Harvard were Architecture Department Chair Walter Gropius, who had resettled in America after fleeing Nazi Germany in 1934, and visiting professor of town planning at University College London, Sir William Holford, who invented the post-war English new towns. These men encouraged Hancock to expand his horizons by studying architecture and urban design in addition to landscape architecture. However, it was Hancock's father-in-law, Carl Fraser, who changed his life forever. While Hancock was hard at work at Harvard studying Ebenezer Howard's 1902 book Garden Cities of Tomorrow, and the brand new idea of shopping malls and how they might work as central hubs in housing developments, his father-in-law was put in charge of developing the land his boss, E.P. Taylor, had purchased. When Hancock caught wind of this, he was interested, naturally, to see what sort of plans his father-in-law had commissioned for this huge piece of North York Township. To make a very long yet very interesting story short, the son-in-law convinced the father-in-law that the plans for an average housing development just wouldn't do, and that, while only 27 years old, he was the man for the job. Although not finished his postgraduate degree at Harvard, Hancock decided he could learn a good deal more actually implementing the concepts taught to him by Gropius, Holford, and landscape architect Hideo Sasaki, physically at Don Mills rather than on paper in the Harvard studios. Many, including some of Hancock's professors, believed his new town dream was too pie in the sky to ever get built, and furthermore, that Mac was much too young a man to take on such a responsibility. But, backed up by a review and approval of the plans by the prestigious Urban Land Institute in the U.S., and after lengthy consultations with Professor Holford, shovels hit the ground in 1952. There was talk originally of following the American builder William J. Levitt's Levitttown example and christening the development Eptown using E.P. Taylor's initials. There was talk of calling it Yorktown, but Hancock fought for the more bucolic Don Mills to take into account the old farming road and the Don River. Among other hurdles, Don Mills helped start a new trend in large-scale developments. When North York was not able to fund the massive infrastructure necessary for the new development, sewer and water trunk lines in and out of the area, and the construction of a sewage treatment plant, for example, Don Mills Development agreed to provide the financing to the municipality, particularly through the purchasing of North York bonds. If you can imagine, the developer even provided the funding necessary for the construction of Don Mills' first new school. Essentially, Don Mills Development Corporation took much of the financial risk of building new municipal services for this massive development out of the hands of the municipality. Otherwise, Don Mills would simply not have happened. As a directional aside here, if you get to Lawrence Avenue before I'm done, wait at the corner for further direction to our next stop. By 1962, about 29,000 people lived on courts and crescents just like these. There were over 8,000 housing units, of which 4,500 were apartments, 8 elementary schools, 3 secondary schools, 9 churches, that space-age curling rink we talked about, an arena, and the shopping center. And all of those buildings, don't forget, were modern in design. If a builder or architect wanted something more traditional, well, let's just say they weren't welcome to build in Don Mills. Enjoy the walk. Press pause now and press play when you get to the corner of Tremont and Lawrence. You are now standing at the corner of Tremont and Lawrence. Walk slowly to your left, heading east. See those two banks across the street? After we've discussed those, we'll walk back to your car or bike at Shoppers. Did I mention that one of the first Shoppers ever, then called Koffler's Drugstore, was in the original Don Mills Center? Anyhow, those banks. Can you tell which one is more original and which has been renovated? At one time, both looked like the Scotiabank to the east, a floor plate and a flat roof held up by thin posts with a wraparound, set-back wall of glass. You can't get any more honest about how buildings are built than that, can you? The Bank of Montreal filled in their space and added stucco walls at some point, and the modernist honesty has been compromised. If you're familiar with icons of modernist architecture, perhaps you've heard of the Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois. These banks, well, the one that hasn't been renovated anyway, come very close to that design, and that's because the architect, John Cresswell Parkin, who attended Harvard under Gropius just like Mac Hancock, was heavily influenced by another legend, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who taught at the Bauhaus just before the Nazis shut it down, and then at the Illinois Institute of Technology. He designed the Farnsworth House between 1946 and 51. You might also be interested in knowing that he eventually got up to Toronto to design something in the mid-1960s, the Toronto Dominion Centre. And the local firms he partnered with were Bregman and Heyman and the firm that John Cresswell Parkin worked for, John B. Parkin Associates. We'll talk about the Parkin firm a little later on when we visit a pharmaceutical building. John C., by the way, had a very Miesian home on the Bridle Path, which is just a few kilometers away from where you're walking, but it has since been demolished. Here's another teaser for you. Strange as this may sound, John Cresswell Parkin was not related to John Burnett Parkin. In a wonderful 1959 photograph taken by Bank of Nova Scotia in-house architect G.H. Pearsall, we can see how little Scotiabank has changed. While there is a drive-through banking pavilion out front, and the bank looks as if it may have been lengthened, it still manages to give us that crisp, clean, modernist feeling. How different from classical banks with stone columns and pediments. Go ahead and walk back to your car now. Hit pause and then we'll start up again just before you drive off, when I'll tell you how to get to our next stop. Okay, to get to our next stop, the townhouse complex of South Hills Village, you've got to get onto the Donway West. That's one of the ring roads we talked about, and head south. The Donway West is the exit to the west of the Shoppers, between you and the library we walked past. Turn left onto the Donway West and head towards the mall. Go through the lights at Lawrence and follow the curving road around the edge of the shopping area. Turn right on South Hill Drive. Turn left onto Barber Green Road and pull over to park on the side. Don't worry, it's legal. Again, the map on your screen, or the paper guide map, will help get you there. Hit pause now, then hit play when you get there. You are now parked on the side of Barber Green Road. We're going to go for a 10-minute walk to see one of the Don Mills projects that won Canada's most prestigious architectural prize, the Massey Medal. Get out of the car, get across Barber Green Road, and walk back the way you came towards South Hill Drive. On your right is a bit of South Hills Village, but I want to get you into the heart of it. Go over South Hill Drive to Broad Path Road, and turn right to walk up it. Wander through as I tell you about this special little place. When I'm done, I'll get you back to your car. I mentioned earlier that the developers of Don Mills, including Angus McClaskey, Macklin Hancock, and Douglas Lee, wanted it to be a complete town, with all of the diversity of incomes and housing types that any town has. They didn't want a uniform middle-class suburb of detached homes. They wanted detached homes, apartment complexes, rental units, and row housing. They wanted a town with a place to live for people of all income brackets. Before Don Mills, row housing hardly had a good reputation. In urban cores, it was synonymous with urban blight. Too crowded, no room to breathe, no room for anything. South Hills Village was designed in 1956, in the early years of the build-out of the Don Mills plan. From an essay by architect Bridget Shim in the 2001 book, East West, A Guide to Where People Live in Downtown Toronto.
Don Mills became the first testing ground for many new and innovative developments in housing. Don Mills development recognized the need for both rental housing units and single-family dwellings. James Murray's and Henry Fleece's South Hills Village, 1956, is modeled on Pittsburgh's Chatham Village. Stein and Wright, site planners and consultant architects, Ingraham and Boyd, architects, 1932. The 190 rental units, mostly two-story with a split-level entrance, are simply built, and their straightforward use of materials, such as brick and wood, is direct and honest. As the density increased from single-family dwellings to row houses, more land was allocated for common use. South Hills Village offered private, individual green spaces and extensive communal areas facing visually pleasing internal streets.
Row houses were considered to be sort of an inferior form of housing because when they're on a small street, that's one after the other, they can be pretty dull. First of all, the variation that we introduced in house designs. And the second is actually the fact that the plan itself was not linear, but was an interesting curved street so that the houses could follow that street. And also we made different use of the contours. A split-level house was sloping up or down.
Henry Fleece also once told me in that wonderful German accent of his, these days it probably wouldn't be considered earth-shaking, but at the time row housing was considered to be slums. So one of the things we did is have a place for the daily garbage, so it wouldn't be sitting out on the street. You can still see the garbage bunks today in the waist-high brick walls with wooden doors beside the entrances. Times have changed, and Toronto's blue and gray mega bins have made these little hiding places useless for garbage, but thoughtfulness like that exterior garbage bunk, the mix of private and public gardens, and split-level floor plans won them that Massey Medal in the late 1950s. Which Fleece admits was a great surprise.
Well, that came as a great surprise because I think I thought we'd done a pretty ordinary job. It was just a natural thing to design, and we didn't realize that it was really leading in a new direction.
This complex would become a model for others to follow in Don Mills. Bridget Shim gives the examples of Greenbelt Heights Village by Belcourt and Blair, 1958, Flemington Village by Irving Grossman, 1965, and Yorkwoods Village Phases 1 and 2 by Klein and Sears, 1963 and 1965. Now that we've seen award-winning architecture and thought about planned diversity, let's move on to see a very different kind of award-winning architecture, a modernist gem of an industrial plant. To get there, get back to your car. Follow Broadpath Road to Barber Green Road. It's a crescent, so it begins and ends there. Then turn left. You'll see your car up on the right-hand side. Hit pause now, then hit play for instructions when you are ready to drive. You should now be in your car on the side of Barber Green Road and ready to drive. We are going to head straight on from here. While you drive along Barber Green, you'll be able to see some of the light industry that's been here since the 50s. One building in particular still has its original glass and steel curtain wall. See if you can spot it. Just before you get to Don Mills Road, you'll notice a big parking lot on the corner on your right. Park there. Then get out of your car, walk across Don Mills at the lights, and keep walking along the south side of what has become Greenbelt Drive on the other side of Don Mills Road. Walk up the hill past the two office towers on your right, keeping your eye out for a turquoise sign that reads Ortho Biotech. That's the building we'll talk about next. Hit pause now. You should have now made your way on foot from the parking lot on Don Mills Road to the turquoise sign for Ortho Biotech. Move along as you can to get a better view of the low white building across the lawn behind the sign. This gorgeous building made the cover of Canadian Architect magazine in July 1956, so you might say it was the first cover girl or poster boy that Don Mills produced. The building we are looking at today is both the 1955 original and an addition. The original largely faces towards Don Mills Road. The addition is behind it, to the left of the main door. Here, at the Ortho Pharmaceuticals office and plant, we again see architectural honesty in materials. Although much thicker and rendered in concrete by the Parkin office, we can still see the frame of the 1955 building exposed, sort of like a Victorian warehouse has been stripped of its ornamental flesh. The Ortho building's intelligent poster boy good looks were welcomed by Mac Hancock because he'd fought all along to make sure the right kind of industry located here. You see, he didn't want the dirty, smoke-belching industries associated with rough and tumble waterfronts sullying his new town, just as he didn't want carved stone gargoyles looking down from archways over fussy front doors on baronial mansions.
Canada suddenly flowered. It wanted to be modern. It didn't want to be ancient.
Soon, all sorts of clean, modern, white-collar industries were located here, producing everything from electronics to textbooks to architectural drawings. That's right, Hancock, always the persuader, convinced John B. Park and Associates to relocate to Don Mills.
I said, why don't you buy a property up at the upper end there in the industrial belt?
Mm-hmm.
Who would want to be in an industry? I said, this is a new kind of industry. It's pharmaceuticals. It's not where you have a foundry. No.
It was a factory building, really, and the guys that worked there used to call it the factory. But it was a very lightweight, sort of lightweight in terms of structure, not
Yes.
intellectually. They built this office building, and the Park and Partnership, John B. and John C., they operated their architectural practice in the North Industrial area.
One other thing to note here, the green space. It's luxurious, isn't it? Not only was Don Mills to be modern, it was to be open, breathable, lush. No factories built to the edge of the road here. Instead, factories placed in what could be beautiful public parks. We're now heading off to see another residential quadrant, complete with a church, a school, and off-road pedestrian paths to tie them all together. To get there, get out of the parking lot and head north on Don Mills Road. Turn right at the Donway East, and then take your second right onto Moccasin Trail and park on the side of the road there. Hit pause now and play when you get there. Again, if you're confused, follow your map. You are now parked on the side of Moccasin Trail, in the heart of the southeast quadrant. Now hop out of your car. We are going for a fairly lengthy walk to get a little deeper into the planning and residential architecture of Don Mills. Walk back the way you came to the Donway East and turn right. Walk along the sidewalk until you get to a pedestrian pathway on your right called Moccasin Trail Park. Hit pause now, then hit play when you get there. We are now standing at the entrance to Moccasin Trail Park, on the side of the Donway East. I want you to first take a look across the street from you at those low-rise apartments. If you've ever been to Los Angeles or read about the architecture there, you may have heard of dingbats. No? Dingbats were little walk-up apartments built by the hundreds in LA in the 1950s and 60s. They were usually boxy, low, and horizontal, like these, and had plain faces with little more than a Sputnik-shaped light fixture, the street number, and an exotic name to give it some flair, like the Villa Riviera, La Traviata, the Golden Mermaid, or the Tiki. These little buildings remind me of dingbats, although they've got a little more going on if you can believe it. And again, they point to a critical feature of Don Mills planning. We've already heard about its mix of housing options, from single-family homes to row houses to apartment buildings. As you can see from here, the apartment buildings were largely concentrated in the inner core of the bullseye of Don Mills, close to the commercial core. On the one side of the Donway, apartments. On the other, farther away from the center, single-family homes. While we are here, I've got a good apartment story for you. If you're a fan of Toronto modern architecture, you surely know who Viljo-Revel is. If you're just getting into the subject, then I won't leave you hanging. He's the Finnish architect who won the international competition to design our City Hall in 1958, a building many suggest was the signal to the rest of the world that Toronto had finally become something more than a sleepy provincial backwater. When Revel moved to Canada, he lived right up the street from where we're walking. His daughter, Sonia Stewart, who still lives in Toronto, says her dad thought Canada was the land of the future, and when he relocated here, he chose Don Mills partly because of his forced partnership with the Parkin Office, foreign architects must work through a local office, but also because he liked what he saw. His first residence was a rental apartment on the southeast corner of Don Mills Road and Lawrence Avenue, just up there, and when his wife and children joined him in September 1959, they rented another unit in the same building. We had two side by side, remembered Stewart in an interview I did with her in 2005, the children in one and the parents in the other. It's worth noting here that Viljo-Revel died the year before his masterpiece, our famed City Hall, opened to the public in 1965. Don Mills, then, was a community with a diverse range of housing options. It was also a community built with churches and schools. We'll now make our way to our next stop to discuss those. Carry on walking in the direction you were going, down the Donway East. When you get to Greenland Road, turn right and walk to the property line in between the church and the school. Hit pause now and hit play when you get there. At the beginning of this tour, I tried to give you the big picture of Don Mills. A huge tract of land divided into 4 livable neighborhoods, all circling around a common civic and commercial center. For Macklin Hancock, those neighborhoods were not just boundaries on a map. They were to be places both large enough and small enough to constitute a community. He wanted people in those neighborhoods to have a sense of identity and belonging. And in Hancock's mind, the cultural institution which would make that sense of identity possible was the school.
First of all, it's a community. The basic thing in every quadrant has to be learning.
Not only did children spend much of their growing years there, schools were also a congregating factor for adults. Think of adult education groups, cultural study groups, hobby and horticultural groups, all of which in the mid-20th century found comfortable accommodation in public school buildings. Wrote Macklin Hancock and Douglas Lee in 1954, subsequently, the school becomes the cultural heart of each neighborhood. Look at an aerial photo of Don Mills today and you'll note that, true to the design, schools are situated nearly in the middle, or heart, of each quadrant. What's most striking from the air, however, is not the school building, but the huge chunk of green space around it. We've already noted on this tour how important green space was to Don Mills' design. Beyond serving as the cultural heart of each neighborhood, schools and their grounds served as the neighborhood park. In this quadrant, the neighborhood kids were particularly lucky. In front of you is Greenland Public School, originally designed by the firm of Craig, Medill, Abram, and Ingleson, winners of a Massey Silver Medal for another educational building just a few years older than this one. You might recall they also designed the library we talked about earlier. Behind you, and on the other side of the houses on Greenland, is Don Mills Collegiate and Don Mills Middle School, designed on one site by the firm of John B. Park and Associates. Those 2 schools serve all of Don Mills. Greenland School itself was organized in 1955. While Don Mills' first new elementary school was opened in 1953 in its first neighborhood, where this tour began, kids from the gradually filling neighborhoods on the east side of Don Mills Road continued to meet in the old red brick Don Public School building hailing back to the area's rural days. In 1956, the school building in front of you was opened. In the late 1950s, the student population here rose and fell as the school filled, saw students leave for more new schools in other neighborhoods, and sent its grades 7 and 8 students to Don Mills Junior High, now Don Mills Middle School, in 1961. In that year, Greenland became a kindergarten to grade 6 school. By the way, the remarkable addition with the shallow V roof on the left was designed by the firm of Taylor Hariri Pontarini and opened in 2000. It serves as a daycare. What about the churches?
We had a church in each of the quadrants.
Mm-hmm.
We had every denomination that could be thought of.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked out well. It really did.
You probably didn't notice it, but the building that you walked by on the corner of the Donway East and Greenland contains St. Mark's and Myung Sung Presbyterian Church. The site today is dominated by a not-for-profit residential complex run by the church for seniors, families, and those with physical challenges. The story of the adaptive reuse of this site by the church is itself an interesting and increasingly common one in this city. So is the fact that the church building is shared between the original St. Mark's congregation and the Korean Myung Sung congregation. But let's stick to the original Don Mills plan. Across the parking lot, between you and the tall residential building, you'll notice a 2-story wood-shingled, flat-roofed building. That's the 1963 church building, designed by, yet again, the firm of John B. Park and Associates. It's worth noting that when Don Mills was designed in the early 1950s, churches were still a critical part of Toronto's social fabric. For that reason, Macklin Hancock reserved room in each neighborhood for church buildings. And, as in this quadrant, he reserved sites and spots accessible to the whole neighborhood. In fact, he put them right next to the schools, since both were important social and cultural institutions. You can see on your screen an aerial photo showing this site in 1965, the church and the school surrounded by little but grass. Hancock reasoned that while schools would only attract people from the local neighborhood, the churches would likely draw people from other neighborhoods as well. To make the churches accessible to everyone, he put them on the Donway, the ring road connecting all of the neighborhoods together. That also kept Sunday traffic on ring roads, and it kept it out of the neighborhoods proper. If you have the time, you can check out some other church sites as well. Donway Baptist Church boasts its lovely original building. It's at 235 the Donway East. The Donway Covenant United Church is on the Donway West, not far from the library we started at. Like other Don Mills buildings, they are great expressions of the modern style. To continue on to one of Don Mills' most beautiful residential streets, keep walking along Greenland until you get to the corner of Deepwood Crescent. Press pause now and press play when you get there. You're now at the corner of Deepwood and Greenland. It's going to take about 6 or 7 minutes to walk this looping street and end up back here. If you're sick of my voice by now, I suppose you could walk in silence, but I do have a lot more to tell you. Turn right now and start walking on Deepwood. I've spoken a lot about the park and office because they did the big flashy stuff. But these little homes are much more important. Why? Well, they represent a huge break with traditional-looking homes. Think about Leaside, just a few kilometers to the west. There's a neighborhood built just 20 years before Don Mills, and the homes are so different. Think also of other 1950s neighborhoods in Toronto. Are the rooflines as radical? Are the homes as unusual-looking? Look around you, and these homes are low to the ground, with extremely shallow roofs to reinforce that relationship. Also, they don't crowd the 60-foot wide lots. Imagine a builder leaving this much space around homes today, because the concept of elbow room was very important to Mac.
I also wanted to have space, so I figured, well, a square you're going to have more space on a piece of land because you can separate the houses, and you can have in the backyard space on which to have outdoor meal in the summer and all those types of things.
Some homes willingly, honestly, show their post and beam construction. When you get to numbers 36, 26, or 20, you'll see what I mean. Compare these original homes to the newer, two-story stucco renovations and rebuilds you see here and there, and you might understand how some Don Millers are nervous about losing what makes this area unique. Through the use of large sections of glass, the original homes on Deepwood invite the outdoors in, blurring the line between nature and shelter. And what nature! These towering trees you see were here long before the homes. This was a stand of old-growth trees that Hancock and Lee left untouched, carefully positioning the houses around them.
We tried to relate it to some of the features, for instance, North Hills Terrace. It was one of the few hilly areas. And then there was Greenland, where it would seem to be fairly flat. And then there was Deepwood Crescent, which was a wooded area on the original farm property, sort of a woodlot area.
This street is called Deepwood for a reason. But modernism wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about how homes functioned. Here's Mac Hancock.
Modernism has to do with where your kitchen is. The house should look out so that on the back of the house you have your place, the place where you want to be living.
In Victorian times, Mac says they had it just the opposite.
You know, the kitchen was at the back of the house because that's where the horse was. You see, you came in and you went to the back of the house. Most housing was carried out by going to the back of the house first, coming in the back. And the front door was almost never used.
These homes are important for other reasons. Despite being built on a massive scale, the fact that Hancock and Lee handed out small batches of lots to approximately 50 builders meant that the cookie-cutter effect, which Levittown was often made fun of for, was avoided.
Levittown was a sort of about the same time as Don Mills. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's just a little bit afterwards, if you want to get down to it. And they did everything they could, but it's banal, really, because everything is the same.
There's another great picture that Doug Lee took back in 1953, showing what looks to be a painter or a carpenter looking up at a huge outdoor billboard with a map of the Northwest Quadrant. There were so many builders, this served as a directory as to which builders were building where. You know, so this poor guy, who worked for Greenwood, say, could find his job site that day and not show up at the Allwood, Capitol, Curran Hall, Slightum, or True Steel site.
In the West Coast, they've always been doing modern. They were way ahead in their thinking. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the Spaniards and these other people that were there originally, they had different house-making ideas.
Joseph Eichler, an American developer who built thousands of progressive post and beam modernist homes in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles, has been getting a lot of press lately due to the rediscovery of mid-century modern architecture. While there are many similarities to Eichler neighborhoods, Don Mills is more important because Hancock used a combination of Garden City concepts mixed with the English Newtown model, while Eichler did not. Eichler only used a handful of architects, while Mac used dozens, so there is much less repetition. Often, Eichler residents had to wait years for a strip plaza or even for schools to appear, but Hancock planned all of that at the beginning. But did Mac's utopian Newtown turn out exactly as planned? Well, the answer is both yes and no. Don Mills was widely copied in the years following its construction, and, as you know, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. While Mack and company tried desperately to offer a variety of housing types so that all income groups, including low-paid factory workers, could live here, it didn't work out that way. In The Shape of the City, Toronto Struggles with Modern Planning, former Toronto Mayor John Sewell writes,
"The attempt to create a new town where people lived and worked, the hope was that half the workforce would come from Don Mills, turned out not to square with how people wanted to live their lives. Perhaps because housing prices in Don Mills were so expensive that factory workers could not afford to live there."
In other words, it was a victim of its own success. While Architectural Forum would proclaim Don Mills to be a planner's dream coming true in 1954, there were many who would, decades later, criticize that very same innovative planning for sending people to their cars because of the dead-end streets, T-intersections, and winding roads that were difficult to service with public transit. Of course, Mack could never have predicted this outcome. His idea was that many residents would walk his pathway systems to their very local places of work, or at most, drive a very short distance. Blaming Mack for this failure would be the same as holding his contemporaries responsible for the failure of the Towers in the Park model found at St. Jamestown and Jane Finch and the crime that took hold there later. Planners, we must remember, build the future with the best of intentions and within the context of the best understandings of the day. But human beings have never been easy to figure out, and how they use buildings and streets has not always coincided with how planners hoped they would. And that's what makes planning so very hard to get right. You're probably nearing the end of our Deepwood walk by now. Notice how, even though we're near the DVP, you can't hear any cars? This isn't a coincidence, it's planning. When you get to an intersection, stop and I'll direct you on. You should now be standing on the corner of Deepwood and Greenland, but not the corner we saw before. Yes, these winding, secluded roads can be confusing. If you can figure it out, Deepwood Crescent becomes Greenland here, and to head back the way you came from your car, don't turn right, but keep going straight in the direction you were moving. You're going to walk past where you previously entered Deepwood. Eventually, you'll hit a corner and you'll recognize the school we talked about ahead of you. At this point, we're going to take you a different way back, to allow you a chance to walk on Don Mills off-street pedestrian paths that connect its homes to schools, churches, and shopping, without having to have kids walking on the sidewalk-less roads. So bear with me as I guide you there. When you get to the intersection with Plateau Crescent before you get to the school, I'll direct you further on. As you walk, I'll just mention that these neighborhoods, the ones built in the 50s and 60s, are at their most vulnerable right now. Not many people see this sort of architecture as worthy of preservation, and, as a result, there are very, very few post-war residential neighborhoods that have protected heritage status. So far, there's only one in Canada, St. Mary's in Kitchener. It's a grouping of small, unadorned homes constructed in the mid to late 1940s by the federal government to provide, quote, low-cost rental housing at a time of considerable need, end quote. The Heritage Conservation District designation was approved in 2002. So what's an HCD? It's a set of agreed-upon guidelines that are then turned into bylaws. If I've been successful showing you around today, you may agree that Don Mills is no place for stuccoed Georgian boxes sporting ostentatious columns and pediments, so specific items such as these could, in essence, be outlawed for future construction. Don Mills' specific features, such as ground-hugging roofs, muted paint schemes, and smaller footprints relative to the large lots, would be enforced for additions to existing houses and even the construction of new ones. And if, for example, restriction of paint colors became a sticking point during preliminary discussions, there was a sudden need for the freedom to paint homes bright purple, it could be excluded, since HCD rules can be as lax or as tough as the residents desire. In the United States, the first post-World War II neighborhood to achieve historic district status on the National Register of Historic Places is Denver's Arapahoe Acres, built between 1949 and 1957. While the number of architects involved there was far fewer than in Don Mills, the neighborhood of post and beam homes with an earth tone palette and horizontal forms has much in common with Mack Hancock's baby. Hit pause now and hit play at the intersection with Plateau Crescent. You are now at the intersection of Greenland and Plateau Crescent. Turn left onto Plateau, then take the first right. Walk along until you get to number 94. In between number 94 and number 78, yes, the numbers make an odd jump here, you'll see a paved pathway. When you get there, start walking the pathway between the houses and into the schoolyard beyond. A nice way for kids on this street to get to school. Just into the schoolyard, take the first path on your left. In just a few more meters, you'll hit the main Moccasin Trail. You can hit pause now and hit play when you get there. You should now be standing in the middle of a paved trail through the rear of the Greenland Public School grounds and called Moccasin Trail Park. To get you oriented, over across the field is Greenland Public School and St. Mark's Presbyterian Church. If you walked towards the back of the church on this path, you would end up where we stood to talk about the dingbats. If you walk the other way, down into the woods, you'd eventually emerge onto the road that will take you down into a park in the bottom of the Don Valley. We've talked at length about the design of Don Mills and about how that design attempted to manage traffic, both pedestrian and otherwise. When planning how people would get around in Don Mills, Hancock tried to provide car-free paths for children to walk to school and for people to walk from neighborhood to neighborhood. In 1954, Hancock and Lee wrote that their plans envisioned, quote, green fingers of parkland and pedestrian walks which would lead in from the perimeter of the neighborhood to connect pedestrians to the central open space and school, end quote. You are now on one of those green fingers of parkland. These fingers stretch across parts of Don Mills, in between backyards into schoolyards, and in between more backyards. To get their full effect, look at an aerial photo of the first neighborhood built, that in the northwest quadrant. There, paths on thin green stretches of parkland can take you from Don Mills Road over to Leslie Street, with branches off to streets, schoolyards, and the Don Mills Center, now the shops at Don Mills. These paths are proof that, for the planners of Don Mills, this new town would plan for the car, but it would also attempt to enhance neighborhood life by limiting car traffic, think cul-de-sacs and crescents, and by providing for pedestrians as well. Don Mills was about driving, and its plan has been criticized for that in a period when cars have become the bane of sustainable development, no question. But Don Mills was also about people walking from their home to school, or to shopping, or to visit their neighbor. These paths are easy to lose sight of, literally and otherwise, but they are a significant gesture to pedestrians, and they should not be forgotten. I'm going to ask you to now keep walking in the direction you were heading before, across the main trail and along a short path between another couple of houses, and back out onto the streets. Pay attention to your map here. The street you will arrive on will be Moccasin Trail, confusing I know. Turn right, keep walking, and you'll eventually find your car. Hit pause now, and when you get in your car, ready to head to the next stop, hit play. Now that you're back in your car, I want you to listen to a neat story about Guy Toy Court, which we'll soon pass on the left on our way to the next stop. Funny name, eh? Here's Doug Lee.
We used to work late at night. It was really quite crazy because I was living in the Toronto chapter of my fraternity house at the time, and I used to get in at 4 in the morning because we were working really late, planning out streets, choosing street names, and so we'd always go out for dinner, and more often than not we'd be down in Chinatown, and one of our favorite dishes was a soup made of what English people would call mustard greens, but in Chinese it's gai toi. And so we went back one night after dinner and worked away at street naming, and we came to this little court. It ended up being named Guy Toy Court.
Don Mills really was planned with a couple of 20-somethings in the lead. They were brilliant, and they had fun. So now get turned around, carefully, and leave Moccasin Trail by turning left onto the Donway East. Then make a quick right onto Don Mills Road, heading north. Get over into the left lane so you can turn into the parking lot of the shops at Don Mills at Clock Tower Road, the first set of lights. You can park anywhere, but to keep our bearings, I'd suggest you turn right from Clock Tower Road into the parking lot and find a place to park. Hit pause now, and when you've parked, hit play. You are now parked in the most recent incarnation of Don Mills' central commercial core. This is our last stop, and I want to walk you to the water feature at Aggie Hogg Gardens and Marie Labatt Road. To get there, walk back through the parking lot to the road you came in on, Clock Tower Road. Turn right and walk until you get to the Clock Tower, a boisterous creation by Canadian Douglas Copeland, which has various 1950s house styles hanging like flower petals from a tall post. When you get there, look diagonally across the grassy Village Square area, an ice rink in the winter. In the warmer months, there's a water feature over there with public washrooms close by. Both are on the corner of Marie Labatt Road and Aggie Hogg Gardens. As an aside, many of the names of the streets in this shopping area are named after people from the history of Don Mills. On the same corner are 3 Heritage Toronto plaques commemorating Don Mills. Make your way over there now. Hit pause and hit play when you get there. You are now by the water feature and the 3 Heritage Toronto plaques that I mentioned earlier. These I'll let you read on your own, but you'll see photographs of the original Don Mills Centre when it was an open-air shopping area like it is again with this, the 3rd generation. The original was designed by, you guessed it, John C. Parkin, but it was almost designed by Walter Gropius, the Harvard professor and Bauhaus legend we've already discussed. I'll let Mac pick up the story.
I also asked Walter Gropius, would he not do a design for the center of Don Mills? But he said, no, why would you do that? You just do it yourself.
You actually asked him to design the shopping center?
I did, yes.
So what happened? You phoned him one day?
Yes, I phoned him, and I said, I think it'd be wonderful if you could actually design the city center for, or shall we call it the town center, for Don Mills. And he said, well, Mac, he said, you can design it because I saw you doing the design in our studio. So he said, there's a man by the name of John Parkin. I called him up and said, I think I've got a job for you. He thought that was pretty nice.
And he had studied under Gropius as well.
Yes, and he left there, though, in 1946.
Yes.
Yeah.
So before you were there?
Yes.
After Don Mills, Macklin Hancock would go on to do some site planning for Expo 67, design Erin Mills in the late 1960s, and get this, the new capital city of Tanzania, Dodoma, in the early 1970s. John C. Parkin would design the Bata Shoe headquarters at Eglinton and the DVP, now demolished, the original Terminal 1 at Pearson International Airport, now demolished, then work on both Villa-Revel's City Hall as well as Mises' TD Centre. He died in 1988 in Toronto. Henry Fleece would co-design Sherway Gardens and a shopping center in Baltimore with James A. Murray, as well as high-rises, supermarkets, and just about everything else in Toronto, but continued to live in Don Mills until moving to a retirement home in 2009. After Don Mills, Doug Lee would teach at U of T for 37 years. Oh, and he'd take a year sabbatical to help Mac with the Tanzania project. Is a neighborhood designed and built between 1953 and 1965 heritage? We at Heritage Toronto think it is, and so do many architectural historians. But convincing the general public won't be easy. Well, it might be a little easier now that we've convinced you, right? There are a few folks in Don Mills who worry about the invasion of big new homes which ignore the early guidelines of Don Mills planners, both in their appearance and in their placement on the lot.
The main thing was to try to keep initially, at any rate, to try to keep the sizes down because naturally builders wanted to maximize their return, and of course they wanted to build larger houses, and we wanted to keep sizes of the houses down in order to enable more people to be able to afford them. Because we did design 60-foot lots, which was larger than what was going on at the time, and they look now today to be gigantic, 60-foot frontages. You'll find that a lot of the old houses in Don Mills were torn down, and these so-called monster houses have been built on them because they had a 60-foot frontage lot.
There has been preliminary talk of an HCD here, so we'll see what happens. Maybe by the time you listen to this podcast, one will be in the works. While it's not on the tour, if you're interested, I can show you what can happen when developers are allowed to build without guidelines. After you've had a stroll around here and you're back in your car, find Kirkdale Crescent, Banbury Road, or Hurlingham Crescent in your map book and drive along them before you head home. Thanks for joining me today, and thanks for caring about our built heritage. This is Dave LeBlanc, signing off. How would Macklin Hancock himself like to be remembered when he sheds his mortal coil?
When I'm buried?
Yeah.
Oh, I think just as a person that tried to do something for his country, but also tried to do something for society wherever that need was necessary. And I feel good about it.
You feel you were a success?
People think so.
Well, I think so, but I'm just asking what you think.
I feel as though I was successful.
This iTour was written for Heritage Toronto by Dave LeBlanc, architourist for the Globe and Mail and News Talk 1010, with additional material provided by Heritage Toronto's Gary Miedema. The tour was produced by PopStream Digital for Heritage Toronto and was financially supported by the RBC Foundation. You can find credits for the archival photographs on the Heritage Toronto website, where you can also find more information about Heritage Toronto.